Chapter 5 of The Airplane Boys Among the Clouds by John Luther Langworthy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by P.J. Morgan. Chapter 5 Figuring It All Out. It begins to look as though you were right, Andy, and that these strangers certainly feel an uncommon interest in what we've been doing up here, said Frank seriously. Oh, I don't take much of the credit for hitting on that idea, Frank, declared the other bird boy quickly. You kept watching that marsh right from the start. I could see a question in your eye every time you looked at him, and it spurred me on to keeping closer tab over his ways. Are they still up there, do you think? Queried Frank, while Larry, Elephant, and Stuttering Nat hung around, saying nothing, but listening for all they were worth. No, replied Andy. I've got an idea they began to suspect some of you were looking that way. Anyhow, I saw Marsh duck his head, and think they came down. No use going in to take a shy at 'em now. I'd give a fit to know what they are up to, mused Frank, a thoughtful look on his face. Well, perhaps we can hit somewhere near the facts if we start guessing, remarked Andy with a knowing nod. Look here, you've been turning it over your mind, then? Asked his cousin. Sure I have, grinned Andy promptly. Never could bear to let anything puzzle me long. Used to lie awake half the night trying to clinch a name that had just slipped a cog in my memory. All right, suppose you give us the benefit of what you decided might be the answer to this problem. Who are these two men, Andy? You know they admit being well up in aviation, the other remarked as a preliminary. So Larry and Elephant said, Frank replied. And that not only had they attended many meets, but admitted being well acquainted with a lot of people whose names we see in the papers every day, men who have done things along the line of aviation. Get that, Frank? I have. Now go on with your answer, nodded the other encouragingly. These gentlemen have been sent up here for a purpose. Perhaps they are in the pay of some unscrupulous manufacturer of airplanes who would not be above stealing the ideas of two boys and applying them to his up-to-date machines, placed on the market and for sale to the public. Gosh! Exclaimed Elephant. That sounds all the good to me, remarked Larry, while Nat tried to express himself intelligently along similar lines, but being suddenly seized with one of his spasms, was obliged to take it out in numerous mouthings and a working of his facial muscles, all the while making unintelligible sounds. Frank seemed to consider this startling proposition of his cousin, for there were lines about his forehead and his eyes took on a reflective look. Now I can see already that you don't agree with me wholly, Andy said, quickly, for he was accustomed to studying that countenance of his cousin, and could read between the lines. Well, I'd hate to think that any maker of airplanes could descend that low as to want to steal ideas from anyone, Frank answered. They are few in number, and so far as we know, honorable men. If they wanted to get something that you and I, or any other fellow, had happened to hit on, and which would be of value to aviators, the chances are they'd send somebody to open up negotiations and offer to buy the improvement outright, or take it on a royalty basis. Perhaps you're right, Frank, admitted the other, but all the same there was something I didn't like about that Mr. Marsh. I warrant you he's a sharp one and a dicker. He looked it. But see here, what have you got to offer in place of my poor little kicked-out suggestion? There's some sort of answer to the puzzle, and 5 to 1 you've guessed it. Frank laughed as he replied, Hold on now, I may be just as far off as you are. As usual, we look at things on opposite sides, you know, Andy. But we never disagree, and that's one good thing about our partnership. Either you convince me, or I show you. Sure we do, Frank, and 9 times out of 10 it's your game. When I make a hit, it's a great day for a handy bird. But please, hurry up and tell us what you think. Yes, said Larry, who had been moving restlessly about, being consumed with the fever of curiosity. Who do you say Mr. Marsh and his friend are, Frank? To begin with, just as you did, the fact that they admit knowing many people connected with the game strengthens my suspicion. I too believe they may be connected with some maker of airplanes like the Wrights. But instead of being sent up here to steal our ideas, they have come as detectives to find out if the bird boys have been lifting any patented inventions belonging to their employers. Whew, that takes my breath away, gasped Andy. It's sure a screamer, that's what, cried Larry. Frank, go up head, said Elephant solemnly, Stammering Nat wanted to say something the worst kind, but being still under the domination of his nervous excitement, he could only work his jaws and violently nod his head. But then that stood for acclamation on his part, and so they all understood it. "Frank, I begin to cave already," declared Andy, "because that would account for the way they stared so hard at our hydroplane and the aluminum pontoons under the body. But we bought those from the patentee and have the bill of sale to show for it. And there isn't a single stolen idea about the machine," Frank went on. "I've been mighty careful about that. I believe in an inventor having full credit for his work. If ever I do happen on a valuable device, I would want to feel that it couldn't be stolen away from me." "Listen, boys," Larry spoke up. "That would account for something that Mr. Marsh said when we were talking to them before little Tommy took our attention. As near as I can remember, I'd been telling them about your shop and how you fellas just haunted it all winter working on lots of ideas. He turned to his friend and he says he, Longley, they might be willing to let us have a little peep into that wonderful shop of theirs, eh?" "Yes, that sounds interesting," remarked Frank. "Go on, Larry, what did you say to that?" "Oh, Elfin here took the words right out of my mouth, Frank. He up and says I wouldn't bank too much on that, mister. Both of us are chums of the Bird Boys, and if they wouldn't let us come inside their shop all winter, I guess they ain't inviting strangers there." "How did they take that?" continued Frank. "Mr. Marsh just laughed and asked the other man what he thought of that. Said it was mighty interesting to run across a couple of bright young inventors so unexpectedly, and that Wright and Curtis ought to know the Bird Boys. Also remarked as he winked at Longley that you might be induced to join the big airplane makers' trust that was being talked of. But I believed he was just joshing when he said that, Frank." "It's all in the wash, though, and mighty interesting," Frank continued, still thoughtful. "And you can take it from me, them gentlemen never just happened on Bloomsbury like they said," Elephant declared emphatically. "I agree with you there, Elephant," Frank echoed. "They came here to do something. It may be, as Andy said, to steal our thunder, if so be we had anything worth lifting. And then again, my idea may be the right one, and that they represent owners of patents who are determined to protect their rights and things they've spent time and money in perfecting. Perhaps we may never know the truth. And then again, before many days or even hours, we might run across the answer." "Well," remarked Andy complacently, "one thing's sure, we've got to take extra measures to protect our shop and keep prying fingers from meddling. I'll speak to my father and Colonel Josiah about it. They may hire old Shea again to watch of nights." Colonel Josiah Wimpers had been Andy's guardian during the time he believed his father to be dead. The old man was lame and used a crutch, but he was a great admirer of the Bird Boys and ready to back anything they advocated. Once a great traveler, he had been to every corner of the world, and was full of the most thrilling stories of what had happened to him during his 40 years of roving in queer places. "Excuse me from Shea," laughed Frank. "Don't you remember how he failed us last year and was caught napping? He's as honest as the day is long, but a mighty poor guard. No, we'll have to do just what we did before, take up our lodgings right here in the shop where we can defend our property." "That suits me okay," returned the jovial Andy. "And so we'll consider it settled, Frank, that so long as these mysterious strangers are around Bloomsbury, we'll just camp out here." "And then some," continued the other, "because you see they might guess what we had up our sleeve and just pretend to move along." "It's a measly shame, that's what," grumbled Larry. Elephant immediately fell upon him and shook his hand vigorously. "Me too," he exclaimed, looking unusually sad. "What's all this row about, fellas?" demanded Frank, pretending not to understand. "It's ghastly to have all the good things pass us by, that's what," Larry declared. "Meaning what?" Andy inquired. "Think of the bully good times you two can have here playing at camping out. You've even got a stove handy, and a whole outfit of aluminum cooking-ware to be carried along with your airplane when you go off a long ways. There never was a luckier pair than you two Bird Boys, that's what." And Larry groaned again to express the envy that was burning in his boyish soul. "If you'd only let us bring over our blankets and sleep here with you, it would lighten things up a heap, I tell you, Frank," said Elephant. "We wouldn't occupy much room," went on Larry eagerly, thinking he saw signs of giving in on the other's face. "Why, you could chuck Elephant under the workbench and never find him again, And I'd sling a hammock in the corner. Looky here, if you say no, I'll feel like jumping in the lake right away." Frank and Andy exchanged glances. They were genuinely fond of the strangely mated pair. And besides, there was no longer any reason why these old chums should be longer refused the liberty they had once enjoyed of entering the workshop as they pleased. "It's a go, Larry, eh, Andy?" said the taller of the bird boys. With that, the two favored ones indulged in sundry whoops and leaps to express the joy that Frank's announcement had given. Even stammering Nat grinned, and no doubt wished he had been included in the invitation, though he knew there would be no room for a further increase in the guardians of the shop. "I'm going right home and get my blankets," said Elephant eagerly. "And me ditto," echoed Larry. "Hey, fellas, you know what dandy doughnuts my mother makes? Shall I fetch a bunch along with a loaf of bread?" "Fine," laughed Andy, "and be off with you." "Hold on, boys," Frank broke in just then. "Let's see what this procession coming along the road means. 2 hay wagons, and each loaded with some crates of merchandise. Beside each driver I notice a second figure, and unless I'm mistaken, the first one is Percy Shelley Carberry." "That's right," remarked Larry. "And it's his crony Sandy Hollinshead on the second wagon. Say, you're gazing right now on the wonderful new airplane which your rival Percy has sent for, and in which he means to make you fellas look like 2 cents. Hey, what's this I see?" "They've stopped short, that's all," observed Andy. "An automobile has blocked the road, and Percy seems to be having a confab with one of the parties in the car. Frank, do you see who those men are? The very gents we were talking about. And now they've struck another scent, for they seem to be bent on learning all about who these boys carrying a crated airplane and parts can be. The mystery grows. My word, but there's going to be lots doing around here soon." End of Chapter 5. Recording by P.J. Morgan.